thank you for turning out tonight in such a wonderful crowd on a Friday night on a long weekend. For those of you who don't know her work, you're in for an interesting evening. I think, in my view, what I walked away, what I said to Greg Elbow earlier today, she says things that need to be said. You may not agree with her, but they do need to be said in the time that we are living. And you'll obviously hear a lot more from her, and Leo Panich will make an introduction shortly. And I do want to thank CUPE Ontario, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Ontario Division. They have provided funding year after year after year for the Phyllis Clarke Lecture. In addition to CUPE Ontario, we have the CUPE locals here at Rye, Local 3904, Local 233, and Local 1281. And again, all of them have provided funds at different times over the past 14 years. I should introduce myself. I never do. Many of you know me already. In fact, I know many of you. I'm Brian Evans. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Politics and Public Administration, and I've organized the lecture now. I think it's my 14th year. Time to retire, maybe. And then tonight's actually the 28th annual lecture. They began in March 8th, 1989. Reg Whittaker, a longtime friend of Leo's, was the very, very first Phyllis Clarke speaker. For those of you, many of you I can tell are veterans. You've been here before, you've heard the spiel about Phyllis. But for those of you who haven't, you know, we've been running this lecture named after her. She died on March 21, 1988, and from 1989 onward, every year, except for two, we've had a lecture in her honor. And Phyllis was, you know, a dedicated trade unionist, a dedicated feminist and socialist her entire life, a longtime member of the Communist Party of Canada. In fact, she ran for the Communist Party of Canada in a handful of elections. In 1953, she ran in a riding called Prince Albert, who, some of you may know, was represented by nobody other than a certain John George Diefenbaker. Now, in that election in 1953, I hate to break it to you, she didn't win, right? But a few years later, in 1962, she ran in Davenport, here in downtown Toronto, against, what was his name, Gordon? Walter Gordon, who became the Minister of Finance in the Pearson government, and probably, you know, the most progressive-ish finance minister we ever had in Canada. But again, she failed to take that one, as you can imagine. She did run for the Toronto Board of Control in the late 1960s and won nearly 17,000 votes. And a reporter in the Toronto Star writing about the outcome was quite aghast at the fact that a known communist would do that well. And Phyllis was a founding member of the Canadian Union of Educational Workers, which in 1995 joined CUPE. She had been a member of the union from which the Canadian Union of Educational Workers emerged, even before that, going back into the 1950s, late 1950s. And she did her PhD at U of T, defending her dissertation in 1975, and then worked in my department until the time of her death in 1988.
There's probably never been a more appropriate Phyllis Clarke lecture than Jodi. And I mean that very seriously. Appropriate because Phyllis was, in her time, in the 60s and 70s in particular, the most prominent communist with a large C intellectual in this country. It was never an easy thing to be. Harder, perhaps sometimes than others, but you know, the Red Scare connotations, the notion that anyone who was a member of the Canadian Communist Party was therefore a Stalinist and responsible for the Gulag, you know, was around, and it was a badge of courage, I always thought. on Phyllis's part, never to have relinquished that, and indeed to have stood up for it. Well, there's no one on the political left today, I'd say almost anywhere, who has done more courageously to rehabilitate the notion of communism as a desirable thing for the 21st century than Jodi Dean. She's done it courageously. She doesn't mean it in the sense of Stalinism. In fact, that's part of her point. And part of what she's doing is actually to take on the narrowness with which that term continues to be employed, including on the left. But it represents for her, as she has put it often, the collective desire for collectivity. And what makes that all the more important, since people could appreciate it at that level without necessarily thinking it was dangerous, is she insists that politics is not politics if it doesn't involve party. It's politics is not politics if it doesn't involve the state. And although I often chide her for her Leninism, in one sense she departs with Lenin, at least theoretically, if not practically, in insisting that a communist future does have to involve a state, does have to involve collective institutions through which people decide how they're going to run their lives collectively and democratically. So that's my introduction. Now, normally, I would simply say that someone has produced a dozen books, and isn't that marvelous? But I think in this case, the books are worth reading. I won't read every one of the books, but you get a sense of who Jodi is and her history and trajectory by reading these book titles. I should say she's now a professor at Wayne and Hobart Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. She did a BA at Princeton, having come from Alabama, she told me, and then an MA and PhD at Columbia. But her first book, very significantly, I think, given that it's 22 years ago, was entitled Solidarity of Strangers, Feminism After Identity Politics. We're still waiting for that second coming, Jodi. Her second big book, that she single authored, as she did others that were co-edited, co-authored, was called Aliens in America: Conspiracy Cultures from Outer Space to Cyberspace. And what was significant about that was she took seriously the beliefs that people had in aliens. Seriously in the sense of, why were they believing this? What did it signify that people believed in these conspiracy theories at the end of the 20th century in America? And that reflected, I think, the kind of creativity for which she picked up the Lacanian, the discourse theory, in ways that so few other people did, looking at these things only abstractly. The next one was Publicity's Secret: How Technoculture Capitalizes on Democracy. And a subsequent one, a few years later, was Reformatting Politics, Information Technology and Global Civil Society. And then was her big book, Blog Theory, with Paula D. in 2010, the subtitle of which was Feedback and Capture in the Circuits of Drive. Why I'm stressing those three is this was the foundation, those three books, of what probably outside of the left that is actually interested in hearing a lecture on 4 Theses on the Comrade, was that she had developed there her theory of communicative capitalism. Her understanding at the cutting edge of capitalism's technological and commercial revolution, the understanding of the way in which the internet, cyberspace, has combined with capitalism in a capitalist democracy to produce a commodified form of networking without substance, without goal, without purpose in a way, but commodified. Now, we come to what she's become so important for, her book, The Communist Horizon, with Verso in 2012, where she articulates what I began with most clearly in terms of the collective desire for collectivity. And then, I didn't bring it, you can hold it up. Greg brought the copy so you all can see it. Her latest book, Crowds and Party, which explicitly takes on what has been debilitating about the left, the radicalism of the left over the last 15, 20 years. Its admirable tendency to protest, but as I've often said, the inevitability that if all you do is protest, you'll protest till hell freezes over and not change the world. And recognizing, moreover, that a great many people who have engaged courageously in these protests are themselves feeling the frustration of that. And in writing this, and she was writing this, of course, in 2014, 2015, before the Sanders insurgency, before the Corbyn insurgency, making it very clear that if there was going to be an effective politics, it had to be a party politics, and making it more courageously clear that it had to be a communist party politics. With that, Jodi.
Thanks so much to Brian and to Leah for the introductions. Can you hear me in the back? Is the sound all right? And thank you guys for coming out on a Friday night. I'm just totally thrilled and humbled and honored by being invited to give the Phyllis Clarke lecture. So I just want to express my gratitude. I'm going to start with a video that finds comrades in sort of surprising places.
The Democratic Party here tonight, Mr. Bernie Sanders. Bernie, you look like $1 million. Or to put it in terms you'll understand, you look like 37,000 donations of $27 each. A lot of folks have been surprised by the Bernie phenomenon, especially as appeal to young people, but not me. I get it. Just recently, a young person came up to me and said she was sick of politicians standing in the way of her dreams. As if we were actually going to let Malia go to Burning Man this year. What's not going to happen? Bernie might have let her go. Not us. I am hurt, though, Bernie, that you've been distancing yourself a little from me. I mean, that's just not something that you do to your comrade.
He's like a cop.
The last joke points to the socialist opening that Sanders' campaign cut into U.S. politics. Now, at first glance, you might think that this was red baiting, right? Obama's thinly veiled reminder that Sanders was a self-identified socialist and thus politically unacceptable. But this reminder could also have been less red baiting than it was simply highlighting the fact that Sanders wasn't actually a member of the Democratic Party, and so wasn't Obama's party comrade at all. Right? Sanders was running for the Democratic nomination, but he wasn't a Democrat. An additional layer to the joke appears when we recall the U.S. rights attacks on Obama as himself a communist or socialist. For 8 years, the right excoriated Obama as the most radical left-wing president the U.S. has ever had. Calling out Comrade Obama, it associated Obama with Lenin and Stalin, Che and Mao. This right-wing context makes sense of the unexpected appearance of Comrade, in the words of a U.S. president, when we recognize that the joke points not to Sanders as a comrade, but to Obama as a comrade. Obama is referring to himself as Sanders' comrade, to himself as someone who shares with Sanders a common political horizon, the emancipatory, egalitarian, communist horizon, denoted by the term comrade. If they are on the same side, if Obama is Sanders' comrade, then Obama should be able to expect a little solidarity. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is the way that the term comrade points to a relation and a set of expectations for action. Comrade doesn't name an identity. It highlights the sameness of those who share a politics, a common horizon of political action. If you're a comrade, you don't publicly distance yourself even a little bit from your party. Comradeship binds action, and in this binding, works to direct action toward a certain future. For communists, this is the egalitarian future of a society emancipated from the determinations of capitalist production and reorganized according to the free association, common benefit, and collective decisions of the producers. So my talk this evening then is going to try to set out this idea of comradeship with 4 theses. I'm going to begin by talking about our present moment. So we can think about the present in terms of 2 opposed tendencies that I see as dominating left theory and activism. I'm going to just call these 2 tendencies survivors and systems. The first, survivors, inhabit social media, academic environments, and some activist networks. It is voiced often through intense attachments to identity and appeals to intersectionality. The second, the emphasis on systems, predominates in more aesthetic and conceptual venues as a post-humanist concern with geology, extinction, algorithms, hyperobjects, biosystems, and planetary exhaustion. So on the one side, we have survivors, those with nothing left to cling to but their identities, often identities forged through struggles to survive and attached to the pain and trauma of these struggles. And on the other, we have systems, processes operating at a scale so vast, so complex, that we can scarcely conceive, let alone affect them. Now, these two tendencies correspond to neoliberal capitalism's dismantling of social institutions. They correspond to the intensification of capitalism via networked, personalized digital media and informatization, what I call communicative capitalism. More and more, people experience more and more economic uncertainty, insecurity, and instability. Jobs are harder to find and easier to lose. Most people can't count on long-term unemployment or expect that benefits like health insurance and retirement packages will remain part of our compensation. Our work is more precarious, flex work, temp work, contract work, ideologically garnished as entrepreneurial. Unions are smaller and weaker. Schools and universities face cuts to budgets and faculty, additions of administrators and students, more debt, less respect. Pummeled by competition, debt, and the general dismantling of the remnants of public and infrastructural supports, families crumble. Neoliberal ideology glosses the situation as one where individuals have more choice, more opportunity to exercise personal responsibility. Now, people with a background in political theory might recall Carl Schmitt's famous characterization of liberalism as a system that replaces politics with ethics and economics. Correlatively, we should note the displacement of politics specific to neoliberalism. There is individualized self-cultivation, self-management, self-reliance, self-absorption, and at the same time, impersonal determining processes, circuits, and systems. We have responsible individuals who are responsibilized, treated as loci of autonomous choices and decisions, and yet we have individuals encountering situations that are utterly determining and outside our control. Instead of ethics and economics, neoliberalism's displacement of politics manifests in the opposition between survivors and systems. The former struggle to persist in conditions of unlivability rather than to seize and transform these conditions. The latter are systems and hyper-objects determining us, often aesthetic objects or algorithmic objects, or objects of future algorithms and aesthetics, something to view and diagram and predict and maybe mourn, but very difficult to affect. Survivors experience their vulnerability. Some sometimes come to cherish it and to derive their sense of themselves from their survival against all that is stacked against them. The sociologist Jennifer Silva has a great book about this, and Silva interviews a number of working class adults in Massachusetts and Virginia. And what she learns is that many emphasize their self-reliance, right? They experience other people as likely to fail them, likely to betray them. So to survive, they can only count on themselves. Some of the young adults she interviews describe struggles with illness and battles with addiction, the challenge of overcoming dysfunctional families and abusive relationships. For them, the fight to survive is the key feature of an identity imagined as dignified and heroic because it has to produce itself by itself. Accounts of systems are typically devoid of survivors, right? Human lives don't matter. The presumption that they matter is taken to be an epistemological failure or ontological crime in need of remedy. Bacteria and rocks, planetary or even galactic processes are what need to be taken into account, right? Brought in to redirect thought away from anthropocentric hubris. When people appear in these accounts, they are the problem, a planetary excess that needs to be curtailed. A destructive species run amok, the glitch of life. This opposition between survivors and systems gives us a left devoid of politics. Both tendencies reject political struggle. The divisive struggle over common conditions on behalf of a common project and future become utterly unintelligible. In the place of politics, we have the fragmenting assertion of particularity, of unique survival, and the obsession with the encroaching, unavoidable impossibility of survival. Politics is effaced in the impasse of individualized survivability under conditions of generalized non-survival, right? Under conditions of extinction. Now, however strong the survivors and system tendencies are on the contemporary left, our present setting also provides some openings for politics. And so I'm going to highlight 4 of these. Right? So I think that we've got these 2 dominant survivor and system discourses going on, but there are other openings that I think we need to capitalize on and be alert to. So I'm going to list 4 of these. First, communicative capitalism is marked by the power of many, right? The power of number. Capitalist and state power emphasizes big data and the knowledge generated by finding correlations in enormous data sets. Social media is driven by the power of number. How many friends and followers, how many shares and retweets. Yet at the same time, on the streets and in the movements, we see further emphasis on number, right? The many rioting, demonstrating, occupying, and blockading. Second opening. Identity is no longer able to ground a left politics uttered in its name. No political repercussions follow from the assertion of a specific identity. Attributions now of identity are immediately complicated, critiqued, and rejected. Third, because of the astronomical increase in demands on our attention that circulate in communicative capitalism, a series of communicative shortcuts have emerged. Hashtags, memes, emojis, reaction gifs, and the linguistic patterns that are optimized for search engines, right? List, questions, these kinds of little indicators and hooks and lures that get people to click on BuzzFeed, right? The way that all headlines now have the same kind of, oh, he got home from the army. What did his dog do? And then, of course, you click, what did the dog do? So these shortcuts point to the prominence of generic markers, common images, and common symbols that facilitate communicative flow, that keep circulation liquid. If we had to read, much less think about everything we share online, our social media networks would slow down and clog up. The generic serves increasingly as a container for multiplicities of incommunicable contents. So I'm going to emphasize the generic a lot. Fourth, the movements themselves have come up against the limits of horizontality, individuality, and rhetorics of allyship that presuppose fixed identities and interests. The response has been renewed interest in the politics of parties and questions of the party form. There's a renewed emphasis on organizing the many. Cutting through and across the impasse of survivor and system is thus a new turn toward arrangements of the many and the institutions of the common. So this is the background against which I'm going to consider the comrade, or the background of this current diagnosis of the problem, but also the openings of possibility. And my argument is that the comrade figures a political relation that shifts us away from preoccupations with survivors and systems, away from unique particularity and the impossibility of politics, and toward the sameness of those fighting on the same side. Okay, so my first thesis then is right there. I won't read it out right now. So I'm going to talk about the comrade. There's the first thesis. One of the things that's sort of wild about once one starts looking into the figure of the comrade is you start to notice how there's multiple figures of political relation in the history of political ideas. Right? For centuries, political theorists have sought to explain power and its exercise via expositions of the duties and responsibilities of particular political figures, right? Like Machiavelli talking about the prince. And in the history of political ideas, you got countless treatises on monarchs and tyrants and kings, right? Political theorists worry about the citizen and the foreigner, the neighbor and the stranger, lord and vassal, friend and enemy. Political theorist inquiries have extended into the household, right? Master and slave, husband and wife, parent and child, sister and brother. They continue into the workplace, schoolmaster and pupil, bourgeois and proletarian. Yet, for all of these figurations of power, its generation and its exercise, in the history of political ideas, there's no account of the comrade. The comrade does not appear. Now, you might think, well, in American political theory, that makes a lot of sense, given the legacy of the Cold War. But the Cold War can't account for why so few socialist and communist theorists have produced systematic accounts of the characteristics and expectations of comrades. There are a couple of exceptions, though. One exception is Alexandra Kollontai, and another is Maxime Gorky. Now, they're not political theorists, and they don't provide systematic or analytical accounts of the comrade as a figure of political relation, but they do give us an affective opening into the utopian promise of comradeship. In her writings on prostitution, sex, and the family, from the early years of the Bolshevik Revolution, Kollontai presents comradeship and solidarity as sensibilities necessary for building a communist society. She associates comradeship with, quote, a feeling of belongingness, a relation among free and equal communist workers. She writes, in place of the individual and egoistic family, a great universal family of workers will develop, in which all the workers, men and women, will above all be comrades, end quote. For Kollontai, then, comrade points to a mode of belonging opposed to the isolation, hierarchy, and oppression of bourgeois forms of relation, particularly that of the family under capitalism. Comradeship is a mode characterized by equality, solidarity, and respect. Collectivity replaces egoism and self-assertion. In Russian, the word comrade, tovarish, is gender neutral, so it replaces gendered forms of address. Gorky has a short story from the early 20th century, which was published in English in 1906 in the magazine called The Social Democrat, and the short story is simply called Comrade. Now, the story is totally over the top. I absolutely love it. It testifies to the life-giving power of the word comrade. Gorky presents comrade as a word that, quote, had come to unite the whole world, to lift all men up the summits of liberty and bind with new ties, the strong ties of mutual respect, end quote. The story depicts a dismal, torturous city, a city of hostility, violence, humiliation, and rage. And in this awful city, the weak submit to the dominance of the strong. And then, in the midst of this miserable suffering, one word rings out, comrade. And the people cease to be slaves. They refuse to submit. They become conscious of their strength. They recognize that they themselves are the force of life. When people say comrade, they change the world. Gorky's examples include the prostitute who feels a hand on her shoulder and then weeps with joy as she turns around and hears the word comrade. With this word, she's interpolated not as a self-commodifying object to be enjoyed by another, but as an equal in common struggle against the very conditions requiring commodification. His additional examples are beggars, coachmen, young combatants, and for all of them, comrade shines like a star that guides them to the future. So, like Kollontai, Gorky associates the word comrade with freedom from servitude and oppression, with equality. Like her, he presents the comrade as opposed to capitalist egoisms, exploitation, hierarchy, competition, and misery. And like Kollontai, Gorky links comradeship to a struggle for and vision of a future in which all will be comrades. Now, there's similarly romantic celebrations of relations between comrades present elsewhere. It's not just a Bolshevik thing. In the American journal, The Comrade, which was, it's like a utopian socialist journal. It was published between 1901 and 1905. It's kind of like a illustrated monthly that targeted to an audience of ethical-minded middle-class socialists. And it featured poems, short fiction, articles on industry and the conditions of the working class, translations from European socialist, and autobiographical essays of the sort, How I Became a Socialist. This journal, it was inspired by Walt Whitman's manly love of comrades. And so it echoes Whitman's homoeroticism, homosociality, and celebratory queerness. In the journal, comrade relations are relations of a new type, relations that disrupt the confines of the family and heteropatriarchy. One of my favorite contributions to this is a short story called The Slave of a Slave. And the protagonist of the story is a tomboy, right? A young woman who basically, we'd call her Butch now, but in the story she's called a tomboy. So she tries to save a poor woman from her brutal husband, and failing to do so, right? She fails. But she then she expresses gratitude in the story that she herself will never become a woman. So we've got this great kind of, gender queerness back in this early text. The Comrade also featured poems extolling comrades and comradeships. There's a poem by George Herron called A Song of Tomorrow that dreamed of comrade love that will fill the world. Another poem by Edwin Markham is called The Love of Comrades, and it evoked comrade bees. An additional Herron poem turned comrade into a prefix. So throughout the poem, you've got comrade day, comrade home, comrade march, comrade future, and comrade stars. Russian constructivist Alexander Rodchenko also expanded the field of comradeship in this sort of in the same general direction by including comrade objects and comrade things. In 1925, he writes, "Our things in our hands must also be comrades." So these examples from Bolsheviks and the Comrade link comradeship to a future characterized by equality and belonging, by a future characterized by a love and respect between equals that's so great that it can't be contained in human relations, but spans to include insects and galleries and galaxies, bees and stars, and objects themselves. Comrade marks the division between the world of misery we have and the egalitarian communist world that will be. Now, Just like we've seen in this Russian revolutionary history and the early 20th century Whitman-inspired homosocialism, so in contemporary Chinese does the term comrade, tongji, replace hierarchical and gendered relations and gendered designations of relation with an ideal of egalitarianism and utopianism. In contemporary Chinese, tongji also means gay. According to Hong Wei Bao, tongji is intrinsically queer. He writes, it maps social relations in a new way, a way that opens the traditional family and kinship structure to relations and connections between strangers who share the same political views, and it transforms private intimacy into public intimacy. Bao's queer comrades resonate with Jason Frank's reading of Whitman's ethos of comradeship in the Calamus poems. Erotic, comradely relations destabilize and overcome, quote, identitarian differences of locality, ethnicity, class and occupation, sex, race, and sexuality. So, Kollontai, Gorky, and their queer comrades inspired that first thesis on the comrade. Comrade is a generic and egalitarian, and for communist, utopian, figure of political relation. The egalitarian dimension of comrade names a relation that cuts through the determinations given by the present. This sense of comrade comes through in the conclusion of The Wretched of the Earth. As Fanon, we can't put Fanon in here? Wait, let's go backwards. Sorry. What happened to my Fanon picture?
He was there.
Oh, he was there? Oh, good, okay. Phew. All right, so he was there, and then we've got the negative. Okay. So, let me I just really want Fanon on the screen. There we go, thank you. Okay, so we get this sense of comrade in this kind of egalitarian cutting through way that I'm mentioning in the conclusion of Wretched of the Earth, when Fanon appeals to his readers repeatedly as comrades. He writes, "Come, comrades, the European game is finally over. We must look for something else." And then the very last line of the book, "For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man." Comrade is a mode of address appropriate to this endeavor. It's egalitarian, generic, and abstract. And in the context of hierarchy, fragmentation, and oppression, it's utopian. Now I gotta go back to the gloomy one. All right, today though, in a setting that is ever more nationalist and authoritarian, increasingly competitive, unequal, and immiserated, a world of Anthropocenic exhaustion, it seems hard to recapture the hope, futurity, and sense of shared struggle, part of this earlier revolutionary tradition. So what's comradeship for us? My wager is that a speculative composite account of comradeship, I made up that term to make it sound like a method. It just means I'm pulling a bunch of stuff together and trying to distill a basic thing out of it. But a speculative compositive account of comradeship, one that distills common elements out of the use of comrade as a mode of address, figure of belonging, and container of shared expectations. I think this can provide us with a view of political relation that's necessary for us in the present, that's necessary for us now. Comrades are more than survivors. They are those on the same side of a struggle for an emancipated, egalitarian world. So who is the comrade? We're going to see this in this next clip, which is the first scene in which Greta Garbo appears in Ernst Lubitsch's 1939 film, Ninotchka.
I said sorry things. Maybe we've missed them already. How can you find somebody without knowing what he looks like? That must be the one. Yes, he looks like a comrade. No, that's not him. This is... You very much.
I'm looking for Michael Simonovich Ironov.
I am Michael Simonovich Ironov.
I'm Nina Ivanova Yakushova, Envoy Extraordinary, acting under the direct orders of Comrade Commissar Senior. Present as your colleagues.
Comrade Boyanov.
Comrade.
Comrade Karpatsky.
Comrade.
What a charming idea for Moscow to surprise you with a lady, comrade.
Vietnam, we would have greeted you with flowers.
Don't make an issue of my womanhood. We're here to work, all of us. Let's not waste any time. Shall we go?
Water, here, please.
What do you want?
May I have your bags, madame?
Why?
He's a proctor, he wants to carry them.
Why? Why should you carry other people's bags?
Well, that's my business, madame.
That's no business. That's social injustice.
That depends on the tip.
So, Ivanov, Bulyanov, and Kopalsky, right, are trying to meet their comrade, but who is the comrade? Anyone could be their comrade, but not everyone. Some people are clearly not comrades. Ivanov, Bulyanov, and Kopalsky can't figure out who their comrade is by looking at them. Identity has nothing to do with comradeship. That anyone but not everyone can be a comrade accentuates how comrade names a relation that is at the same time a division. It's premised on inclusion and exclusion. Anyone but not everyone can be a comrade. It is not an infinitely open or flexible relation, but one premised on division and struggle. There's an enemy. But unlike Schmidt's classic account of the political in terms of the intensity of the antagonism between friend and enemy, comradeship doesn't concern the enemy. The fact of the enemy, the fact of struggle, is the condition or setting of comradeship, but it does not determine the relation between comrades. Comrades are those on the same side of the division. With respect to this division, they are the same. Their sameness is that of those who are on the same side. To say comrade is to announce a belonging and the sameness that comes from being on the same side. Now, this sameness appears not simply in the relation between party comrades, but also in the military expression, comrade in arms. Comrade in arms designate those who fight on the same side against an enemy, another military, another set of comrades in arms. In his introduction to Wretched of the Earth, Sartre writes that, quote, every comrade in arms represents the nation for every other comrade. Their brotherly love is the reverse side of the hatred they feel for you, end quote. Sartre's slide into the language of brotherhood brings out the ethnic and blood underpinnings of the nation that Schmidt's term friend occludes. Sartre alerts us then not only to comrade in arms' common relation to the enemy, right, the hated, the one killed. He alerts us not only to how comrades in arms are those on the same side, but also to the distinction between the comrade in arms and the comrade as a figure of belonging in the socialist and communist political tradition. The solidarity of comrades is not an inverted hatred. As we saw with Kollontai and Gorky, it's a response to fragmentation, hierarchy, isolation, and oppression. In their being on the same side, comrades confront and reject fragmentation, hierarchy, isolation, and oppression with an egalitarian promise of belonging. So to reiterate, that anyone but not everyone can be a comrade highlights how comradeship designates a relation and a division, us and them, a political relation, but one that is not the same as the relation between friend and enemy, which is an absolute and exclusive state relation. Instead, there's a space of possibility. Anyone can be a comrade, but not everyone. And there's also a space for non-belonging. That you are not my comrade does not necessarily mean that you're my enemy. Now, I think we can gain some more clarity on the term comrade and what comradeship provides, if we start trying to distinguish the way it's used by socialists and communists from other kinds of relations. I'm going to make a bunch of distinction how to show that comrade is a different kind of relation from other ones. So the relation between comrades is not the same as kinship. It's not a kinship relation. It's not the same as relations between brothers and sisters and parents and children, spouses or cousins. Right? Your cousin might be your comrade, but when you add comrade, you're saying something else. You're designating an aspect of the relation that the relation between cousins doesn't designate. Right? Comrade adds a political element to it, highlighting that you're on the same side in a political struggle. You share a politics that exceeds your blood or kinship relation. Because kin always disagree politically. Right? We can be related by blood without sharing a politics. And of course, the same holds for marriage. People can be spouses without being comrades. Frida Kahlo actually said famously of Diego Rivera, whom she married twice, that Diego is not anybody's husband, never will be, but he's a great comrade. So yeah, it was an inversion. So, and just as the relationship between comrades is not mediated by blood or marriage, it's also not mediated via inheritance. Rather than passing on property and privilege, comrade cuts against them, disrupting their hierarchies with the egalitarian insistence of those fighting together on the same side. So comrade's not the same as a kinship relation. The comrade is also not the neighbor. Living near someone does not make them your comrade. We may be part of the same locality, the same community, tribe, or neighborhood without being comrades. Comradeship does not designate a spatial relation or an obligation stemming from proximity or shared sociality. Third, the comrade is not the citizen. Citizenship is a relation mediated by the state. Comradeship exceeds the state. It doesn't take the state as its frame of reference. You can find comrades all over the world. That journal from the US in the beginning of the 20th century, The Comrade, is super interesting on this score as it collects letters and speeches and all sorts of writing from European socialists. Right? The US socialists aren't part of any international yet, but yet they affiliate themselves with an international political movement. Comrade's rupture of citizen also manifests when we note state fear of communists as traitors, as those with loyalties to an organization other than the state. Now, in the US during the Cold War, and still today in the right-wing rhetoric, comrade is used in a derogatory way to accentuate the dangerous otherness of communists. Right? Comrades may oppose other citizens. The relation between comrades is not the same as relations between friends. Claudio Lumnitz's book, The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón, helps illustrate this point. Lumnitz describes the life world of the Partido Liberal Mexicano, a transnational network of revolutionary libertarian communists operating in Mexico and the US and engaging in the Mexican Revolution. Mexican immigrants and exiles living in the US intertwined political work and the work to survive under capitalist conditions. Devoting everything to their cause, some comrades opened themselves up to the opportunism of the less committed, to the exploitation of those who began to prioritize making their own way in the US. Tensions around sharing and work, politics and commitment bled into suspicion of infiltrators. Lumnitz writes, quote, "And if a comrade was thought to be opportunistic and had personal ambitions, that person could be prone to selling out and maybe even to selling out his comrades. For this reason, the line between personal dislikes and suspicions of treason could get thin, and work was required to keep them distinct," end quote. Comrades may be friends, but friendship and comradeship are not the same. And we see this as we see this as friendships start to fray. But personal dislike does not mean that the person is not a comrade. In tight associations, comrade and friend relations blur and overlap, but maintaining the difference, the distance, is crucial, and it takes work, important work. Comradeship requires a degree of alienation from the needs and demands of personal life to which friends must attend. Now, we learned from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that friendship is a direct relation between two people for the benefit of each other. It's a relationship anchored in the person for the benefit or excellence of the individual. In contrast, comradeship is broad, bees and stars. Someone previously unknown now revealed as a comrade. Comradeship extends through intimate relations to stretch into relations with those we don't know personally at all. Anyone can be a comrade, whether they like me or not, whether they are like me or not. So this distinction between the comrade and the friend points to the inhuman dimension of the comrade. Comradeship has nothing to do with the person or personality in its specificity. It's generic. Comradeship abstracts from the specifics of individual lives, from the uniqueness of lived experience. It concerns, rather, the sameness that comes from being on the same side in a political struggle. In this sense, the comrade is liberated from the determinations of specificity. The comrade is freed by the common political horizon. In a kind of indirect way, the historian Ellen Schrecker makes this point in her magisterial account of anti-communism in the United States. During the McCarthy period of communist persecution, there was a common assumption that all communists were the same. Communists were depicted as puppets, cogs, automatons, robots, and even slaves. In the words of one of the McCarthy-era's professional witnesses, people who became communists were, quote, no longer individuals, but robots. They were chained in an intellectual and moral slavery that was far worse than any prison, end quote. The truth underlying the hyperbolic claims of the anti-communist is the generic quality or genericity of the comrade. The truth refers to this comrade as a disciplined and disciplining relation that exceeds personal interest. Comradeship isn't personal, it's political. So the other relations, kin, neighbor, citizen, friend, index degenerations of comradeship, errors that comrades make when they substantialize comradeship via race, ethnicity, nationality, and personality. And you can see this substantializing error in Italian and German uses of comrade. Camerata for Italian, camarad for German. When they use that as a term of address, they were actually referring to fascist. It's fascist in Italy to say camarada. It's fascist in Germany to say kamerad. So they use different terms in the socialist tradition there. So Genosse and Genossen would be comrade in German, and in Italian it's compagno, compagna. So the actual terms have the really direct translation have these substantialations, this substantialization built into them. Anyway, back to the kind of concluding point on this one. The emancipatory, egalitarian energy of comrade, its life-giving capacity and ability to map social relations in a new way is a product of its generic quality, its genericity. It's a product of the fact that anyone, but not everyone, can be a comrade. When comradeship bleeds into nationality, ethnicity, or race, when it is mistaken for a relation supposed to benefit an individual, and when it is equated with relations mediated by the state, the cut of the generic is lost. So I've been emphasizing then that comradeship is not a relation of identity. As we saw in Ninotchka, an issue should not be made of her womanhood, right? They were all there to do work. Comrade doesn't designate or specify an identity. And as we saw in the film clip again, comrade attaches to proper name, Comrade Yashukova. The proper name carries the individual identity, and the term of address asserts the sameness, right? Comrade takes the place of sir, madam, or citizen. Comrade negates the specificity of a determined title. Right? It negates the specificity that inscribes difference and hierarchy, and it replaces it with a positive insistence on an equalizing sameness. Now, my comrade Oksana Timofeeva emphasizes that in comradeship, identity vanishes. And she gives the example of the masquerade used by Bolsheviks undercover. Anyone could be a comrade under that mustache. The historian I mentioned, Ellen Schrecker, provides another example, a quote from a guy who was an attorney general under Eisenhower. His name was Brunel, and Brunel was really suspicious of communists. And he was suspicious because, in his words, it was almost impossible to spot them, since they no longer use membership cards or other written documents which will identify them for what they are. So in these examples, it's the generic comrade who appears, carried by an individual person, yes, but the one who appears is one of many. It could be anyone. Right? Schrecker quotes this undercover informer, anyone can be a communist. Anyone can suddenly appear as a Communist Party member, close friend, brother, employee, or even employer, leading citizen, or trusted public servant. Bertolt Brecht's cantata, The Measures Taken, or Die Maßnahme, similarly explores this antithetical relation between individual identity and the comrade. In the cantata, 4 agitators are on trial before a party central committee. It's called the control chorus in the writing. And they're on trial for the murder of their young comrade. The agitators describe how they went undercover in order to reach Chinese workers that they were trying to organize. And each agitator had to efface their identity to be, quote, nameless and without a past, empty pages on which the revolution may write its instructions, end quote. Each agitator, including the young comrade, agrees to fight for communism and be themselves no longer. They all put on Chinese masks, appearing as Chinese rather than as German and Russian. However, the young comrade repeatedly substitutes his judgment for that of the party, encouraging action before the time is right. He can see with his own 2 eyes that misery cannot wait. He tears up the party writings. He tears up and off his mask. He substitutes his judgment for the party's, thereby exposing them all. Now fleeing the Chinese authorities, the agitators and the young comrade race to escape the city, but they realize that since the young comrade has been exposed, since he is now identifiable, they will have to kill him. And the young comrade agrees, so they shoot him and throw him into a lime pit that will burn away all traces of him and return to their work. Comrades are multiple, replaceable, fungible. They are elements in collectives, even collections. In several Romance languages, comrade originates as a term for those who travel together, who share a room or enjoy something together. To be a comrade is to share a sameness with another with respect to where both are going. For I was wondering if I should just cut something short, but I changed my mind. I'm not going to. Now, in post-1991 Russia, during their transition, shock treatment, during the transition to capitalism, the term comrade started to be discredited. And my comrade and friend Alla Ivanchikova told me that this was actually a political struggle that was fought through etymologies. And there were new etymologies that were frequently issued that were trying to depoliticize and mock the term comrade. And so in these kind of alternative, or let's say capitalist etymologies, they emphasized the origin of the word comrade in the word tovar, or commodity, a good for sale. And my friend Alla Ivanchikova explains that this clearly serves the purpose of showing that underneath all talk of camaraderie, there are monetary and market relations that rule the day. Right? Any comrade, tovarish, is a commodity, tovar, if you pay the right price. The counter etymologies, right, the people's etymologies, insist that tovar is a much older term than commodity or good produced for sale. In fact, tovar derives from the ancient word for military camp, tavaru, and soldiers in this ancient tradition called themselves comrades. Now, you might think, okay, so what about the etymology? But what's neat is that underlying the etymological warfare here is an assumption of sameness. Interchangeability, whether soldier or commodity, schoolchild or fellow traveler, characterizes the comrade. As with puppets, cogs, robots, and slaves, commonality arises not out of identity. One can't identify a comrade. It doesn't arise out of who one is, but out of what is being done, fighting, circulating, studying, traveling, enjoying the same things. Political comrades are those on the same side. Communist comrades are those on the same side of the struggle to emancipate society from capitalism and create new egalitarian modes of free association and collective decision-making for common benefit. Now, for anti-communists, the instrumentalism of comrade relations appears horrifying. Combined with the machinic impersonality and fungibility of comrades, the fact that relations between comrades are produced for an exterior purpose, that they are means rather than ends in themselves, seems morally objectionable. This objection, though, fails to acknowledge the specificity of comradeship as a political relation, as being on the same side in a struggle. It omits the way political work focuses on ends beyond the individual, and so necessarily requires collective coordination. It further presumes a totalizing politics that subsumes all relations, rather than recognizing an abstract politics liberated or alienated from specific social relations. And it contracts and contains the space of meaning into self-relations, as if the abstracted generic relations among those faithful to a political truth could only be the result of manipulation. By the end of the 19th century, comrade was a prominent term in socialist circles. Kirsten Harris finds the first recorded evocation of comradeship in English in the journal Justice in 1884. Some English socialists had been inspired by Whitman's view of the deep fellowship and interconnectedness of comrades. The English embrace of Whitman resonated with the US socialists. In a short essay published in The Comrade in 1903, W. Harrison Riley recounted some of his encounters with Marx. And this keeps the kind of homosocial part of that journal alive. He said that Marx was as good to look at as to listen to, and that he was well-built and remarkably good-looking. And he observed that the internationalists addressed each other as citizen, but said that he disliked the term and frequently substituted Whitman's greeting, comrade. Riley's gesture to Whitman notwithstanding, comrade was part of the political vocabulary of the German socialist. In his writings, Marx used comrade to designate those in the same political party, those sharing the same politics. Party referred not just to a formal organization, but to a broader political movement. In his well-known letter to Kugelmann on the Paris Commune, Marx praises our heroic party comrades in Paris. Now, of course, the communards were not Marx's comrades in a specific party, but in a party understood in the broad historical sense. They were all on the same side, the side of People's Revolution. In a text for the International Working Men's Association written in 1866, Marx drew out this political dimension of comrade. Quote, "It is one of the great purposes of the association to make the workmen of different countries not only feel, but act as brethren and comrades in the army of emancipation," end quote. More than union brothers involved in local and national struggles, members of the IWA would be comrades in international political struggle, fighting on the same side, the side of their class, in the struggle of labor against capital. As comrades in an army of emancipation, They would combine and generalize their efforts. No longer would the differences between foreign and domestic workers be able to be used against them. As comrades, they were all the same. The idea that comrades are those fighting on the same side of a political struggle thus opens up into the fourth thesis. Right? The same side points to the truth comrades are faithful to, the political truth that unites them. Fighting indexes the practices through which comrades enact their fidelity and work to materialize truth in the world. So comrades demonstrate fidelity through political work, through their radical action and militant engagement. This practical political work extends the truth of the emancipatory egalitarian struggle of the oppressed into the world, holding open the gap it inscribes in setting. It inscribes in its setting and building a new body of truth. In the socialist and communist tradition, this body has been the party, understood in both its historical and formal sense. All right, I'm going to conclude. Comrade is what we can talk more. I'm cutting short some of the part 4. We can talk about it in the discussion. Comrade is more than a term of address. It's a figure of political relation that carries expectations for action, the kind of expectations that those on the same side have of each other. Right? We saw this from the beginning with Obama's joke, right? You don't just distance yourself from your comrades. And Kollontai affirms it. The primary virtue of comradeship is solidarity. Fidelity is demonstrated through reliable, consistent, practical action. Differences between parties actually often turn on what comrades can expect of each other, on what it means to be a comrade. Broadly speaking, in most revolutionary socialist and communist parties, comrades are expected to engage in the struggles of the oppressed, organize for action, and maintain a unity of action. Absent expectations of solidarity, comrade as a term of address is just an empty signifier. Rather than figuring a political relation mediated by the truth of communism, it becomes an ironic or nostalgic gesture to past utopian hope. So I've offered 4 theses on the comrade, and my hope is that you can see them as together articulating a generic political component that's activated through divisive fidelity to the emancipatory egalitarian struggle for communism. A comrade is one of many fighting on the same side.